You've heard about the gunfights and outlaws, but there's a hidden side to the old Wild West. Did you know that many Native American cultures were way ahead of their time in embracing alternative genders? They had a special term for it, birdash or two spirits. Take the Zuni tribe, for example. They believed if a man was good at what were traditionally women's tasks, or a woman excelled in men's activities, they were a blend of both genders. And guess what? This was totally valued in their society. It's incredible to think that over 130 tribes across North America recognized and honored two spirits. These individuals weren't just accepted, they were often seen as blessed with extra powers. Now, let's switch gears to the white settlers. Homosexuality wasn't as openly embraced as in native cultures, but the rough and tumble life on the frontier had its own secrets. Many instances of homosexuality and cross-dressing flew totally under the radar. Often these secrets were taken to the grave, but sometimes they were surprisingly uncovered. And I mean literally, like right before burial. Sammy Williams. Here's a wild story. In 1908, an 80-year-old lumberjack named Sammy Williams passed away in Montana. But when the undertaker started preparing the body, they discovered that Sammy, known as a brawny lumberjack, was actually a woman. Can you imagine the shock? John Nunan's wife. And now, here's one of the most intriguing stories from the era. It involves a famous person at the time, George Armstrong Custer, and his wife Elizabeth. Custer's famous 7th Cavalry is stationed at Fort Lincoln in North Dakota. One of Custer's corporals, a guy named John Nunan, married the fort's beloved laundress. She's not just any laundress, though. She's known for baking the most mouth-watering pies and being the go-to midwife for the fort. Her comforting ways made her a favorite, especially among expectant mothers, always asking them, "Are you comf?" Nunan and his wife lived happily for many years until one day Nunan returned from a scouting mission to find his wife has passed away. On her deathbed, she had a peculiar request. She wanted to be buried directly without the usual preparations. But Mrs. Custer and the other ladies at the fort didn't follow her wishes. Mrs. Custer even went out to pick wildflowers for her. When she came back, they uncovered a shocking truth. Mrs. Nunan was actually a man. This revelation rocked the fort. Tragically, overwhelmed by the loss, Corporal Nunan took his own life a few days later. But here's the thing about Elizabeth Custer. She wasn't judgmental about it. Reflecting on Mrs. Nunan, she said, "Poor old dear, I hope she is finally comf." Hery Allen. Now, let's turn to a story that really shook things up in the early 20th century. It's about Hery Allen, a figure who became somewhat of a legend in the Pacific Northwest from 1900 to 1922. His life story reads like a Wild West novel. As early as the 1890s, Hery Allen burst onto the scene, making headlines for all sorts of reasons. He was known for his escapades, theft, vagrancy, bootlegging, saloon brawling, bronco busting, horse stealing, and of course, his love for a stiff drink. Allen wasn't your average cowboy. He stood out. With neatly trimmed hair, a rich baritone voice, and a confident swagger, he took on jobs as a bartender, barber, and longshoreman. But in 1912, Allen's life took a dramatic turn. He was arrested for white slavery, which back then meant crossing state lines with a sex worker. The woman, Isabel Maxwell, was posing as his wife. This arrest wasn't just for the travel, it was also due to vagrancy, a broad term that included various violations like gender nonconformity, in this case a woman dressed as a man. What's fascinating is how open Allen was about his identity. In a candid interview with the Seattle Sunday Times, he laid it all out. "I did not like to be a girl, did not feel like a girl, and never did look like a girl," he declared. Sick at heart over the thought that I would be an outcast for the feminine gender, I conceived the idea of making myself a man. Harry Allen's story is a powerful reminder of the struggles faced by those who defied gender norms in a time when doing so was incredibly challenging. Prostitution in the Old West. All right, that wraps up our journey through some of the most jaw-dropping gender revelations in history. Now let's shift gears and dive into a topic that's as old as the Wild West itself: prostitution. When you think of classic Wild West films, there's often a scene or two featuring prostitution. And no, it's not just because Hollywood loves a bit of scandal. The truth is, prostitution was a massive part of life in Old West towns and cities. From sex workers roaming the streets with sheets in hand to elaborate brothels, it was everywhere. The world of sex work in the Old West was diverse and complex. Sure, some places fit the stereotypic image we've seen in movies, but others treated the profession with a certain level of respect, offering expansive spaces for these workers. It's important to understand the socioeconomic backdrop of this era. Many sex workers were young, often under 30, with limited education and in many cases unable to read or write. They might not have held much social power, but they played a crucial role in the local economy, catering to the needs of miners, railroad workers, and other transient laborers. What's also intriguing is the diversity within this industry. Immigrant women were a significant part of this workforce, and pricing often depended not just on physical appearance, but also on nationality and ethnicity. Just like the miners and railroad workers, these sex workers were a product of the capitalist demands of the time. But as individuals, their stories and struggles often went unnoticed, their contributions to society largely forgotten. Parlor houses. In the Old West, there were various levels of prostitutions. The best, or the top tier, could be found in parlor houses, typically managed by a madam. These workers often dressed stylishly, and there was a practice of changing bed linens after each client. The standard charge for their services was around $25, with additional cost if a client stayed overnight. Saloons and brothels. The next level below were the saloons and brothels. These establishments weren't as lavish as their furnishings, yet they still provided a welcoming atmosphere. Customers could enjoy a drink and converse with the women before heading to a private room. The cost for these services was around $10, although it might increase based on the woman's expertise. The rate of client turnover in these locations was quicker compared to that in the parlor houses. Hurdy-gurdy houses. Around the same tier were hurdy-gurdy houses, where men could pay to dance with women. Many of these women were not sex workers. Typically, a dance cost $1, though occasionally it was free, with the expectation that the men would buy drinks for himself and his partner afterwards, each costing $1. The dancers often consumed cold tea instead of alcohol. A well-liked dancer could make upwards of $50 in a single evening. Volume brothels. A notch below were the volume brothels, characterized by their worn furniture and run-down bedrooms. Women sat in small cubicles, calling out to potential clients passing by on the street. These women, often older and less appealing, frequently turned to drugs and alcohol. They operated in shifts, with a particularly quick worker able to attend to 25 or more men during a busy day. However, the rates charged for these services were not known. Cribs. Next were the cribs. These establishments were situated in the less desirable areas of the red light districts, comprising rows of modest wooden structures. Each unit had a small front parlor and a bedroom at the back. The bedrooms were compact, barely fitting an iron bed, a washstand, a stove, and a small trunk. The women often covered the foot of the bed with brown oilcloth because the customers usually kept their boots on. On a particularly busy night, an efficient woman could serve up to 80 men, with each visit lasting only a few minutes. While the book doesn't mention specific service rates, it notes that the rental costs for these cribs range from $8 to $20 per week. Many of these women were under the control of pimps. Streetwalkers. Streetwalkers were at the lowest rung of the ladder. They were usually older and had lost their youthful looks. They'd stand in dimly lit doorways, partly hidden so that their customers couldn't get a good look at them. They were pretty flexible with their rates, sometimes working for just a drink. But there were some who broke the mold, like Julia Boulette. In the 1860s, she had a nice place in Virginia City. She was well-liked, chose her clients, and rumor had it she could make up to $1,000 in a night. Birth control meant ingesting toxins. Prostitution has been a significant aspect of society historically and continues to be today. When discussing this topic, it often leads to conversations about pregnancy and the use of birth control. Now let's dive into why there weren't loads of babies popping up back in the day, even with a more laid-back vibe. Condoms were a thing, but Old West guys weren't really into them. They were hard to find and not that trusty. A lot of times, people would just use certain meds to stop pregnancies. The earliest condoms were from sheep or pig guts, and they cost like $1 each. Guys would even reuse them after washing, but that made them leakier every time. Then in the 1840s, rubber condoms hit the scene. But get this, they still messed up more than 10% of the time. It was mostly the ladies of the night who started using them to dodge pregnancy and diseases. It took way longer for married couples to get on board. They even tried mixing a stuff like lemon juice and sulfur with these rubber condoms. But it didn't really cut down the pregnancy risk much more than the basic 10% effectiveness. And with the extra cost and hassle to get them, it wasn't easy for a cowboy just looking to have some fun with his gal or wife. Chemical or mechanical abortion. All right, so healthcare was pretty rough back then, with not enough doctors around and barely any resources. Women often had to make tough calls about unwanted pregnancies. They'd use all sorts of harsh chemicals that could end a pregnancy, but also put the woman in serious danger. We're talking about toxic stuff like ergot and quinine in big doses. Sure, it might work, but it could leave the woman with all sorts of nasty side effects, from kidney damage to heavy bleeding, even death. And then there were the mechanical ways of doing it, which came with the scary risk of bleeding and infection, often leading to death. Women even went to extremes like wearing super tight corsets, starving themselves or hurting themselves on purpose to end a pregnancy. It wasn't until the 1850s that people really started protesting against abortion, and it was finally banned in 1870. Life in the Wild West was tough, especially for women. They had to deal with minimal medical care and the real dangers of giving birth. So they were stuck between a rock and a hard place. Either go for risky ways to end a pregnancy or face the life-threatening challenges of childbirth. This just shows the kind of rough choices and risks women had to face in those harsh frontier times. No privacy during the act. Now, want to know what's crazy? They actually had no privacy during the act. Back in the day in the Wild West, families usually all squished into one tiny room. Imagine everyone from grandma to the little ones all sharing the same space. Not much room for secrets, huh? So you've got to wonder, how did couples manage to get a little alone time, especially with kids or other family members always around in their homes? Okay, let's hop over to Europe for a sec. Things were different there, especially during the Reformation. You've heard of Martin Luther, right? The guy who stuck his big list of complaints on a church door. Well, he also pushed the idea that what happens between a married couple is their own business, kind of like a do not disturb sign. This whole idea of keeping your love life private was a big deal. Back in the States, though, whether you got any privacy or not really depended on how thick your wallet was. If you were rolling in dough, you could snag a house with enough rooms to sneak away for a bit of romance. But for most folks trying to make ends meet in the Wild West, finding a private spot for a little lovey-dovey time was about as likely as finding a diamond in your chicken's nest. For regular people like the average Joe and Jane living in the Wild West, carving out a moment for a little romance, like a quick hug or a little sneaky kiss, was kind of an art form. They often had to manage this with family members hanging around, making it a real exercise to be sneaky. Back in those days, having a private place to yourself was pretty rare. It was a luxury that mostly the rich folks could swing. The majority of people didn't have the dough for such privacy, which made those sweet, intimate moments even harder to come by. It meant getting creative about finding those rare moments of solitude, trying to dodge the watchful eyes and ears of relatives and others living close by. Some things were even too indecent, even for cowboys. Okay, now let's talk about oral pleasure back in the day. In Chad Heap's book, Slumming, Sexual and Racial Encounters in American Nightlife, 1885 to 1940, there's this interesting bit about how people back then saw things differently, especially when it came to the bedroom. Oral pleasure, which a lot of people now think is pretty great, was kind of a rare thing in the Wild West. It's not like people hadn't heard of it. It was more like they thought it was too European or just not their style. Even in the world of night workers, it was so uncommon that those who did offer such services were often looked down upon by their peers. This whole situation really highlights the unique sexual attitudes and taboos people had in the U.S. during the late 1800s and early 1900s. It was a time when what was considered normal or acceptable in the bedroom was way different from what many think today. It's kind of wild to think about how much things have changed since then. Their vernacular was vastly different. Back in the Old West, the way people talked about, bedroom stuff, was pretty different from how we chat about it today. They had their own set of slang and terms that might sound kind of funny to us now. Take the word peer rooting, for instance. This was their quirky way of referring to getting it on. It's a term you don't hear much these days, but back then it was part of their everyday lingo. This whole unique way of talking about intimate activities really shows how the culture and expressions in the Wild West were a world of their own. People had a different way of saying things, and peer rooting is just one example of how their language was as colorful and unique as their lifestyle. Assault was far too common. Moving on to a much harsher topic, assault. The Old West, often thought of as the cool place of cowboys and wild adventures, actually had a pretty rough side to it. It was mostly a guy's world, and women often ended up getting the short end of the stick, having to deal with some harsh situations. In those frontier towns, there wasn't much in the way of police or rules, which made it easy for bad guys to get away with all sorts of things. This was especially rough for women, especially if they were on their own or living out in the sticks. They were at a big risk of being attacked. What made things worse was how people thought back then. If something bad happened to a woman, a lot of times people would blame her, not the person who actually did something wrong. This blame game kept a lot of women from speaking up, and it let the bad guys keep getting away with stuff. Women in the Old West didn't have many options in their lives. Most of them were confined to their homes, unable to earn their own money or live independently. This situation made it really difficult for them to leave bad situations or defend themselves. Back then, there was a lot of silence about sexual assault. People who suffered from it usually kept quiet because they were afraid of not being believed or of facing backlash. This lack of speaking out not only made it easier for the wrongdoers to keep doing harm, but also meant that those who were hurt didn't get the help or support they needed. The history of sexual abuse in the Old West is a harsh reminder of how women have long struggled in societies that don't always protect them. To really tackle this issue, we need to understand the history behind it and be committed to changing negative attitudes. it's important to support and empower those who have been hurt to seek justice and start healing. The influence of religion. Religion was a big deal in how people thought about sex and stuff like that back in the Wild West. A lot of people followed pretty conservative Christian beliefs, like Protestantism, which were all about waiting until marriage and not really talking openly about sex. This created a sort of hush-hush culture around the whole topic. It made it super hard for parents and teachers to have real, honest chats with kids about these things. The transient nature of life. The Wild West was kind of like a moving scene, with people always on the go looking for work or new chances. This constant moving around made it tough to set up things like proper schools and tight-knit communities, which you really need for good, steady sex education. Because everything was so unstable, a lot of kids ended up learning about the birds and the beads in not so great ways, like chatting with friends or just watching what their older brothers, sisters, or neighbors were up to. This kind of hit-and-miss learning often led to wrong ideas and not so great habits when it came to sex. Stigmas associated with sex education. In the Wild West, talking about sex was often off-limits. Many people felt uncomfortable and avoided the topic, worried about what others might think. This made it tough for parents and teachers to chat about it with kids, even when they thought it was necessary. The fear of being judged or feeling embarrassed stopped people from having honest talks, so kids ended up picking up bits and pieces from here and there, which weren't always right. The lack of formal education. In many areas of the Wild West, particularly the rural ones, formal education wasn't really common. As a result, a lot of kids missed out on basic learning about human anatomy, physiology, and how our bodies reproduced. Without this essential understanding, it became even harder for them to get accurate and safe information about sex. The role of social reformers and medical professionals. Even with the dominant social and cultural attitudes of the time, some people in the Wild West understood the value of sex education. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, social reformers and medical experts started pushing for sex education. They argued that it was crucial for public health, preventing unwanted pregnancies, and curbing the spread of sexual transmitted diseases. Over time, their advocacy began to pick up steam, helping to fuel the broader movement of sex education across the United States. Lack of sex education resulted in STD. You see, not knowing much about sex ed really played a part in the spread of sexually transmitted diseases, or STDs, back in the day. People didn't have enough info on how to prevent them or how they're passed on, leading to riskier choices and more cases of STD. The big ones were syphilis, gonorrhea, and chancroid, and they often got around through prostitution, which was pretty common in the boom towns. Plus, people tended to move a lot, taking their infections with them. Treating STDs was a real challenge then. For syphilis, mercury was the go-to, but it didn't always work and could have nasty side effects. Gonorrhea was tough to treat, and there was no cure for chancroid, so STDs often stuck around and could really knock you down. The impact on public health was huge. STDs could lead to infertility, blindness, and sometimes death. They also added to the negative views on prostitution and other sexual behaviors. Now here's a bit more scoop on how STDs were a big deal in the Wild West. Syphilis. This one was a huge problem. It's said that up to 10% of people got syphilis at some point in their lives. That's a lot of folks dealing with it. Gonorrhea, another common troublemaker. They think as many as 20% of guys caught gonorrhea at some time or another. Chancroid. This wasn't as widespread, but it still caused issues. About 5% of men might have had chancroid at some point. The whole situation really shows why knowing about sex ed is crucial. Without it, STDs just ran rampant, causing all sorts of health headaches. It's a pretty clear case for why good, solid sex education is key for keeping STDs in check and helping everyone stay on top of their sexual health. Cowboys as sex slaves. So, in the Wild West, there was this pretty dark side where young cowboys especially faced sexual exploitation, and it was mostly the big shots like ranch owners, cattlemen, and even lawmen who were behind it. There were a few reasons why this was such a problem. Isolation and always moving around. Life out there was lonely and constantly on the move. Cowboys were often far from home and hopped from job to job. This made it super tough to reach out for help or even talk about any bad stuff that happened. Power imbalances. The guys who ran the show, like those owning the ranches or handling the cattle, had a lot of sway over their workers. They controlled not just the job, but pretty much had a grip on the cowboys' day-to-day lives. This power difference made it way easier for them to take advantage of the cowboys. Homophobia and masculinity. The Wild West was all about being macho and tough, and there was a lot of negative talk about anything that didn't fit that mold. Cowboys were expected to be the strong, silent types, and showing any sign of what was seen as weakness or being different, like being gay, could get you in big trouble or even make you an outcast. This made it really hard for cowboys to speak up about abuse because they were scared of how they'd be seen or treated. All these factors piled up, making a rough and risky environment for cowboys where speaking out about abuse was a real challenge in the old Wild West. While we don't have complete data on just how widespread the sexual exploitation of cowboys in the Wild West was, there's a bunch of stories and historical bits and pieces that point to it being a pretty big issue. Here's what we've got to back that up. Cowboy stories. In autobiographies and personal stories, quite a few cowboys talked about facing sexual harassment, abuse, and even being forced into sexual labor. Legal records. The court records from back then also show signs of this problem. There were cases that talk about sexual assault, rape, and prostitution involving cowboys. Cultural representations. This issue wasn't just in real life, it popped up in Wild West stories, movies, and folklore too. This situation was more than just a bad chapter in history. It really messed with the lives of these cowboys. They suffered physically, emotionally, and mentally. Plus, it led to people seeing cowboys in a stigmatized way, feeding into some really negative and harmful stereotypes about their sexuality. Okay, so we can't exactly turn back time and fix everything that went wrong in the past. But it's super important to recognize what happened with the sexual exploitation of cowboys back in the Wild West days. This means really hearing out the folks who went through it, making sure more people know about this part of history, and striving to build a society where this kind of stuff doesn't happen to anyone. And hey, let's not forget, this isn't just an old-timey problem. Sexual exploitation is still a big issue nowadays, and it doesn't just happen to one group of people. We've got to keep spreading the word and doing what we can to stop it from happening again. And that's a wrap on our journey through the untold stories of sexuality in the old Wild West. Thanks for riding along with us today. Remember, history isn't just about the big events, it's also about the personal, often hidden experiences of people just like us. All right, that's it for today. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.